Kia ora tātou. I think we'll probably have some more people joining us as part of this webinar, but I'd like to start us off first with karakia. Kia hora te marino, kia whakapapa pounamu te moana. Hei huarahi mā tātou I te rangi nei. Aroha atu, aroha mai, tātou I a tātou katoa. O tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to our first, now we are 15 webinar being hosted here by the Growing Up in New Zealand study. My name is Sarah Jane. I'm the Research Director of Growing Up, and it's my pleasure to be facilitating our session today. Our webinar is going to start with a presentation from the Growing Up in New Zealand team, who are going to take you through the key findings from their snapshot examining educational outcomes and aspirations for young people at 15 years of age. We will then invite our guests to join us on a panel where I hope we can hear a little bit more about the role of data and evidence, and particularly longitudinal data for generating change. But before we get to that, a little bit of housekeeping from me. For those of you attending the webinar today, please use the Q&A function to submit any questions you might have for our team. We've got people here in the background who will be keeping an eye on the Q&A, and we'll do our best to answer questions live as they come up. So don't wait until the end. We might run out of time. So please share your questions and comments in the Q&A. I'll also be keeping an eye on the questions in case there may be a couple of good ones that we want to take to our panel towards the end of our session. So hopefully many of you know that Growing Up in New Zealand is Aotearoa's largest contemporary longitudinal study of child and youth wellbeing. Participants in our study were recruited in 2009-2010 during pregnancy, and the Growing Up in New Zealand team have been following those family and whānau since that time. The work you're going to hear about today comes from our 15-year checkpoint, which was designed really with two key objectives in mind. The first one was to reach out to our cohort and continue the important work of relationship building with young people and their families. This is really key to the success of any longitudinal study. The second objective of the 15-year checkpoint was to administer a questionnaire so that we could gather important priority evidence, particularly to understand what life is like at 15, which we know is a critical point in the life course where young people are navigating multiple transitions, be it developmental changes, educational changes, but also social changes. As has been the case since the 8-year data collection wave, we've gathered information directly from the young people as well as from their primary caregiver, with our questionnaires covering a range of different wellbeing domains, which you can see here on the screen. Of course, of particular relevance today are the items related to school engagement and educational experiences. But as you'll hear, part of creating these snapshots is really trying to understand how education fits within the broader social and family environment of young people. Release of the Now We Are 15 snapshots is a real highlight of our calendar here at Growing Up in New Zealand, providing an opportunity for the team to showcase the depth and breadth of the data set, but also to start thinking together about the potential for evidence to create change. This year, we've just released 3 snapshots, which you can see on the screen, which we've developed with support from policymakers across government, with community-based organisations and other academic advisors, who all share in our commitment to ensure that Aotearoa really is the best place in the world to be a child. So with all of that in mind, it's my pleasure to introduce our 2 presenters for today, Drs. Denise Newman and Jess Parr, who are research fellows here at Growing Up in New Zealand and who together have led the production of this first snapshot report. Kia ora kōrua, I'm going to hand over to you now. Thank you for your time.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Denise Neumann tōku ingoa, tēnei nui kia koutou. Kia ora everyone, my name is Denise, and thank you so much for joining this webinar today. I'm the lead of the Culture and Identity domain of the Growing Up in New Zealand study, and alongside my colleague Jess, I will present you some insights from our education snapshot today, but also really want to use this opportunity to thank our whole team that have been part of the snapshot, as you can see displayed here as well, and who are also helping us today with this webinar. So what have we been thinking about this education snapshot when we've put it together? So firstly, we really acknowledge this really crucial phase of young people's lives at 15 years, and they're not only shaping their identities, but also, really start forming their aspirations. And so the school setting and the school community they're embedded in is a really important part of their lives, not only shaping their current experiences at 15 years, but also paving their ways for the future pathways. So we're really keen to look into that, and we realized that these experiences actually differ across different groups of young people, but we also saw some common patterns. So this is really important to really look into these nuances and to better understand these factors that are contributing to positive educational outcomes, but also factors that might impact these experiences negatively for young people. And so just an overview, what we actually looked at, what were our questions for this education snapshot. So we're really interested in young people's education outcomes and how these are associated with trajectories of material hardship, with school-related characteristics, as well as other experiences that young people are having. And we were also keen to further zoom into these experiences for young people with disability within the school and education system. And lastly, we're really keen to also hear from the young people, how prepared are they feeling, what are their expectations, aspirations within this formal school setting, because we acknowledge that this is a really important phase of them entering the NCAA and planning for their future pathways. But before we get into that, we wanted to show you a little bit of an overview. Who are the young people in our education snapshot? In total, we had 4,183 young people who were living in Aotearoa at the time point of the 15-year data collection. And those are the ones we will be focusing on as part of this report. Breakdown by ethnic identification, the broad ethnic groupings, we had 23% Maori, 17.2 Pacific, 15.8 Asian, 1.6 Middle Eastern, Latin American, African young people, and about 1% young people of other ethnic groups. And those were all in a total response approach, which means young people were grouped into all of the groups they identified with one exception, that is the sole European group, which is only including young people who are identifying as within the European groups, and those were 49.2% as important comparator group for our analysis. In terms of gender identity, we had 45.5 cisgender boys, 38.5 cisgender girls, and 16% trans, non-binary, or young people unsure of their gender identity. And we also identified 16.7% of young people having a disability in our study. Starting with the first educational outcome we looked at, and this is young people's school satisfaction, which we assess via the agreement to the statement, I like school, which is from the multidimensional students' life satisfaction scale. And for ease of interpretation and analysis, we grouped together their responses of often and almost always as higher school satisfaction, and never and sometimes together as lower school satisfaction. And here in this first graph, you can see the distribution by broad ethnic groupings of this higher versus lower school satisfaction. And if we focus on this blue lower part of the bar, the lower school satisfaction, we can see that about 6 in 10, or respectively 5 in 10 for Pacific and Asian young people, actually indicated lower school satisfaction. So slightly more young people indicating lower school satisfaction. And it might be a little bit tempting to say could be just a normal attitude amongst young people at this age who actually would say that they like school, and that might play a role. But we also acknowledge that this might actually reflect some deeper underlying factors contributing to those experiences with young people, whether it is with their peers or whether it is with the school itself, or just indicating possibly not feeling as greatly connected. And so we're really keen to explore this further. And so the first thing we looked at, how is this experience, higher versus lower school satisfaction, patterned by the young people's experience of discrimination? And so we asked young people whether they had experienced any form of discrimination in the past 12 months. So this could include being treated unfairly because of factors such as skin color, gender identity, sexual orientation, race or ethnicity, disability or health status, way of appearance, and others. And so we recorded that, but also the young people responded they didn't want to answer this question, or they didn't know whether they had experienced discrimination, because research in the discrimination space shows that this might give us a nuanced impression of their experiences rather than grouping it all together. And so what we then did is looked at how this experience of discrimination was mapped for their school satisfaction. And if we look at the blue graph indicating lower school satisfaction, the blue part of the bar graph, for those young people who had not experienced discrimination in the first bar, 56% said that they were experiencing lower school satisfaction, and this was significantly higher for those young people who had actually experienced any form of discrimination, with 66%. And a similar pattern was shown for those other two responses, not knowing or didn't wanting to answer this question. So we can see this pattern clearly here. And so a follow-up question then also asked whether in what situations these young people had experienced discrimination, and a large majority of those who had experienced discrimination did so at school. So again, also, high numbers of experiencing discrimination at school, which could partly relate it to the fact that this is the main social environment of these young people. But again, it might also be other important factors that might contribute to these young people's experiences as well. So we further looked, how the experience of school satisfaction might look like in relation to young people's cultural connectedness, which you can see illustrated here in this graph. And what we looked at was an average score of the multi-group ethnic identity measure. And just a little reminder for those or those who are not as familiar with this box plot graph, what you can see displayed here is the distribution, a visual distribution of this average score, with the middle line indicating the median, and then the box around this indicating where 50% of the distribution was sitting, and then the whiskers indicating the range of the scale, which was from 1 to 5, and higher scores indicated higher cultural connectedness. And so we looked at this for lower school satisfaction versus higher school satisfaction, and as you can see here in this graph, those young people had indicated lower school satisfaction also had a significant lower cultural connectedness experience. We acknowledge this difference might not be huge, but it is relevant, and it is well aligned with what has been found in the literature, how cultural connectedness can contribute to social and emotional well-being at school. We weren't only interested in young people's school satisfaction, but also what their main caregivers' experiences was, to get a bit of a richer perspective. And so we asked young people's main caregivers how well they thought that the child's school understands and responds to their needs, learning needs, cultural needs, and social emotional needs. And we looked at all of these separately and found very similar results. So we were very confident we could group this together into an overall average caregiver satisfaction score, and which ranged from 1 to 5 as well. And here you can see the distribution of this caregiver satisfaction by main ethnic groups. And as you can see, overall, it's looking relatively good across all groups. There's a relatively high satisfaction of the caregivers with the school's support, which is a positive finding. There's a small nuance, but overall it's looking quite positive. And then we did the same thing and mapped this caregiver school satisfaction against young people's experience of discrimination. And we saw a very similar pattern. Those who had experienced discrimination those caregivers had a significant lower reported satisfaction with their young people's schools, which could reflect that they may thought that the schools weren't really fully acknowledging the young people's identity and needs, or weren't maybe as responsive as they would have hoped. And further, we were really interested generally as part of the snapshot how socioeconomic status, structural disadvantages, and structural factors impact on these education outcomes. And one particular aspect we focused on was material hardship. And not only at 15 years, so this is again the big advantage of having a rich data set, longitudinal data set like growing up in New Zealand, we were able actually to look at the family's experience of hardship all the way from early infancy to 15 years. So at several data collection points, we looked at the DEP 17 index, which captures difficulties to afford basic needs, which the caregivers informed us. And then at each data collection point, we grouped whānau into experiencing hardship or not. And then a subsequent complex analysis identified patterns across time. And so what you can see here on the x-axis displayed are these 4 main clusters of hardship that were found. So about a quarter of the cohort never experienced material hardship across the entire time. And then we also had 1/4 who experienced different trajectories. Some experienced some exposure, so sometimes in and out of hardship across time, but we also saw families who had persistently experienced material hardship, as well as some families who had increasing hardship experiences over time. And so, and to add to that, we also saw some stark inequities with Pacific and Maori young people being far more likely than so European young people and families to experience persistent or increasing material hardship. So that just also have in mind. And then again, we looked at these hardship trajectories by caregiver satisfaction, and we could see that any form of hardship compared to no hardship was associated with a lower satisfaction with the caregivers' satisfaction with school, which may reflect the complexity of family having these additional challenges, and may not all of that find being able to access that support at school. And respectively, while we acknowledge schools are a really important social and support environment, they can't really buffer all of these compound impacts of material hardship. And lastly, we also looked at the caregiver school satisfaction by different school types. Here, the 4 main groupings: English medium school or mainstream school, wharekura, which is kaupapa Maori and tikanga Maori grounded curriculum and conducted to an extent in te reo Maori, specialist schools, and other schools such as bilingual units, homeschool, and others. And what we found that school satisfaction was highest in wharekura, followed by other school types, and that was significantly higher than English medium schools. So yeah, taken together as a brief summary for this part, we see varying experience for those young people in their education space. and seeing some similar patterns with factors such as cultural connectedness being very beneficial versus experience of discrimination and hardship having a negative impact on these outcomes. And yeah, on that note, I'm handing it over to Jess, who will give you some more insights from our education snapshot. Kia ora.
Well, thank you, Denise. Kia ora koutou. As you've heard, my name is Jess. I'm a research fellow here at Growing Up in New Zealand, and I'm in charge, or I get the privilege of looking after the education domain, which is the hot topic of today's webinar. So I'm going to move us forward to talk about another outcome that we looked at, and it's how young people, of which the majority are entering their NCEA Level 1 in 2025 when this data was collected, understanding how they deal with academic challenges at school. And this provides us with another dimension to understanding, or at least getting a glimpse into their senior school experience. Academic buoyancy refers to how students perceive their ability to effectively deal with the day-to-day setbacks, challenges, and pressures in an academic setting. It's measured by a validated 4-question tool, and across those 4 questions, an academic buoyancy mean score was derived. So I've just put the questions here on the slide so you know exactly what I'm talking about. Students with higher academic buoyancy tend to report greater school satisfaction and better overall well-being. Growing evidence in the literature also indicates that academic buoyancy is a predictor of students' motivation, engagement, and perception of school support. So what did we find? Cisgender boys reported higher levels of academic buoyancy with a mean score of 4.7 than cisgender girls and trans, non-binary, or young people who are unsure of their gender, both with a mean score of 3.9. Young people's cultural connectedness, again, which you've heard a bit of before now with Denise, was positively associated with academic buoyancy, with higher levels of cultural connectedness being associated with higher levels of academic buoyancy. Conversely, when we asked young people to report on their experiences of any form of discrimination, young people who responded, yes, I don't know, or I don't want to answer the question, were less likely to report high levels of academic buoyancy compared to those that reported no experiences of discrimination. And it's possible that both experiences of discrimination and low academic buoyancy may be shaped by broader structural disadvantages. The literature shows that the compounding effect of multiple experiences of racism and other forms of discrimination on well-being, in other words, the more harm people are exposed to, the less likely they are to manage. And while these key contextual factors have been analysed here in this report, I think we also need to note that the literature points to other critical importances of individual level psychological drivers of academic buoyancy. And we need to acknowledge that constructs such as academic self-efficacy, intrinsic motivations, emotional regulation, persistence, perseverance, school belonging, and teaching support also play a role here. So as part of understanding and listening to the young people in the GWINS cohort and getting to know their school and learning experiences, the snapshot also took a deep dive or a more focused approach to the experience of young people who are identified as having a disability and or additional learning needs. The obvious reason we did this was to better understand where support could be directed and to enable more young people in this cohort to thrive. So disability status, importantly, was assigned to the young people in the GWINS cohort by asking the young person the Washington Group short set on functioning scale. Oof, that's quite a mouthful, which identifies young people with difficulties in areas of seeing, hearing, walking, or climbing stairs, remembering or concentrating, self-care, and communication. So the proportion of young people reporting higher school satisfaction at 15 years was significantly lower among those young people with a disability at 26% compared to those with no disability at 43%. Similarly, young people with a disability reported lower levels of academic buoyancy at 15 years, again, as compared to those with no disability. that young people with a disability reported lower buoyancy scores could reflect the additional stresses and challenges they experience in comparison to those without a disability. An open text box was provided to all our young people in the Gwyn's study to describe what they viewed as the best thing about being themselves. For young people who have been identified in the study as having a disability, there were many themes that emerged amongst these responses that resonated across the cohort. Themes such as peer relationships, whānau, and gratitude at having opportunities, which often included education. Yet more prominent in this subgroup of the cohort who were identified as having a disability was this, I guess, juxtaposition of both celebration of their perceived differences alongside honest reflections of loneliness and resilience. And I'll just give a couple of examples here. One of the Gwyn's young people said, "I love the way my brain works and I'm always entertained by myself." Another said, "I'm a fast learner. I'm bright, kind, clever, quick-minded, and I have the ability to be okay with being alone." And lastly, I'll just finish with this one. An identified quality of another young person was that I always get back up. So we also listened to young people about their education, employment, and aspirations. So I'm going to move there next. Approximately 8 in 10 of the young people in the Gwyn's cohort reported feeling very well, quite well, or somewhat prepared for their 2025 school year. When asked about how far in school do you think you will go, university study was the most common chosen education-related pathway among Gwyn's participants, with 30% of rangatahi Māori choosing this, 35% Pacific youth, 72% Asian, 63% Middle Eastern, Latin American, African, 53% from other chosen ethnic groups, and 49% for the sole European. And while many of the young people in the Growing Up in New Zealand cohort saw tertiary education in their future pathways, this was not the case for all. 1 in 5 Māori and Pacific young people reported they only saw themselves finishing school and they had no further educational aspirations. Not finishing school also featured, with 1 in 10 Māori and sole European young people reporting they would leave before completing secondary school. Young people's aspirations are also evident in the open text responses in our hopes and dreams section of our questionnaire. And it was clear that the future life trajectories of these young people were really important to them. School academic achievement, educational aspirations all merged as reoccurring themes. Education and learning were viewed as highly valued personal qualities and goals to look forward to in the future, but learning and school life was also reported as a source of stress and anxiety. So I put just a handful. Obviously, I couldn't give you however many thousand responses we had, but I've selected a few for the slide here. So when we're reading the words of the young people in this study, alongside the common worries that we often see in middle adolescence, such as love and friendship, relationships and money, passing their NCEA exams or the other exams that they had opted for, getting into university, deciding what to do after school also featured prominently amongst young people's concerns. So this brings me to wrapping up our key findings from the 15-year report. So again, we heard about satisfaction. 6 in 10 young people reported lower levels. However, most caregivers also reported high satisfaction with how schools respond to their child's needs. But as Denise spoke, there were differences in caregivers' satisfaction especially amongst school type and in exposure to material hardship. Greater cultural connectedness was associated with young people reporting higher school satisfaction, while experience of any form of discrimination was associated with young people reporting a lower school satisfaction. Again, cultural connectedness, Greater cultural connectedness was also associated with being better able to, or perceived to be better able to cope with those everyday setbacks at school. Conversely, again, experiences of any form of discrimination was linked to reduced ability to cope with those academic stresses or that academic buoyancy. So overall, when we looked at our deep dive into young people with a disability, they reported lower school satisfaction and lower levels of coping with academic stress. This was compounded by young people with a disability also experiencing more discrimination compared to their peers without a disability. Again, that mainly occurred at school, and they had much higher response rates of reporting health-related discrimination. And lastly, our final point there, most 15-year-olds aspired to continue into further education. Many young people described their school as a place that both motivated and inspired them, but it was also that stress and anxiety around performance and how their future trajectories would unfold. So in listening to the young people and their whānau in the growing up cohort, and we've interpreting this information, how can our systems respond to support and help these young people thrive? This report reveals differences in school satisfaction, academic buoyancy, by cultural connectedness, by socioeconomic conditions, and experiences of discrimination. Schools can help mitigate these influences by providing tailored support to students and families and by fostering inclusive environments. Policy actions that empower schools to eliminate discrimination, strengthen cultural connectedness, and provide tailored support to groups identified as needing further assistance are essential to achieving equitable outcomes. This report has also reinforced that young people do not exist in isolation, and their experiences at school will be shaped by their friends, whānau, communities, and broader societal factors. This emphasizes the need for schools and wider social services to work with families to provide appropriate supports. Most of us here today, and unfortunately I can't see you all, but I'm going to make a broad sort of assumption, are familiar with our policy landscape here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So it'd be great to have some feedback or some questions on how the research at Growing Up in New Zealand supports your work. I'll stop here and I will hand back to Sarah Jane to open the panel to discussion.
Kia ora, Jess. Kia ora, Denise. Thank you both for your excellent presentations and really the sort of detailed analysis that you've been able to bring through this brief Now We Are 15 educational snapshot. So it's now my pleasure to introduce you all to our guest today, Adam Jang Jones. Adam is a friend of Growing Up in New Zealand. He's a team manager in the Ministry of Education's Data and Insights Group, currently overseeing administrative data collections from school. Adam was previously the National Project Manager for the OECD's PISA research program. His research interests include student wellbeing, non-attendance, reading literacy, and environmental education, with a focus on triangulating sources of evidence towards developing actionable insights. Kia ora, Adam. Thank you so much for joining us today and being willing to help us all here on this webinar to really sort of think about the relevance of evidence such as the Growing Up in New Zealand data set for the work that happens within the Ministry of Education. And then perhaps as part of our panel presentation, we might sort of broaden that to the work that all of us can be doing as policymakers, researchers, community workers. So really to kick off the panel, I'll ask perhaps for you to share a little bit about your thoughts on the Now We Are 15 educational snapshot and that role of data and evidence to help shape the work that you're involved with at the Ministry of Education.
Sarah Jane, yes, it's a pleasure to be here. First of all, ko Snowden Tamonga, ko Seven Te Awa, ko Peretania te whakapapāranga mai, e noho ana ahau ki te whanganui ko tapu te ranga toku kanga, ko Adam Jang Jones anō. So these are, I guess, a few humble thoughts. I'm not pretending to speak on behalf of the whole ministry here or policy directions, but from the point of view of a researcher and understanding a little bit of what's moving and the directions that things are currently going in. So first of all, congratulations to the researchers on continuing with growing up in New Zealand and pulling these rich insights from this. I must say that you've all been amazing in engaging proactively with the ministry through this release. So I guess in terms of growing up in New Zealand as a whole and the 15-year data collection wave findings, it's astonishingly rich food for thought. There's I guess in terms of the richness and complexity and the interwoven details of each of these individuals' lives, it shows the nuance and the kind of the human richness in everyone's trajectories, but it also helps us to look for patterns within those lives that might shed greater understanding on what can be gleaned, what kind of patterns we can see, what can be extrapolated to try and improve the experiences, building on the people who've had the good experiences and trying to support the experiences of the next cohorts that come through. So I think that's part of the value. I also want to say congratulations to the group for surfacing the range of views, the charts that show that it's not just an average. There's a huge range of different views. There's some really great there's some real strengths in the voices, the open text voices that are coming through there. So if I look at the value for the education ministry as a whole, I mean, this is huge, and it does affect a lot of things. It reminds us of how people are shaped by their environments, how their academic experiences are shaped by what has come before them in the past, and what their family backgrounds are, what their life circumstances are, and how that plays into school experiences. Yes, I mean, it builds on information and data that we've had before, of course. PISA 2 is 15-year-olds, and some of this does come through in the PISA data, and different but relevant findings about discrimination and the importance of family background. I like that the Growing Up in New Zealand data also sheds light on disabled people's experiences, on the trajectories, the kind of experiences of hardship that people have had in the past, which is a real strength of Growing Up in New Zealand, to be able to paint that longer term picture of where have these young people come from. I mean, in terms of specific areas and policy, there's great value in this in terms of evaluating, policy evaluation, what is working, what doesn't seem to be working for what kids in what situations. There are insights into school satisfaction, how the ministry goes about its role in supporting schools to make sure that the needs of students are better met, the supports are tailored. I think it's also important to speak to the value of this in building that evidence base. So, best evidence doesn't derive from one study, one moment in time, one trend line. It evolves over time, it accumulates, and many of the findings here overlap with different but related findings from our international studies, from the wider research literature. So, Denise, also you pointed out how the findings do align with some of the wider literature. I think there's also value in looking at the different perspectives there. So when we looked at school satisfaction, parents, caregivers had a view that was maybe a little bit rosier than the students in many of those situations. We see the same for attendance data. If you ask the teachers versus the parents versus the child, why are you not attending school? You get so much richness from looking at those different perspectives. Plus, growing up in New Zealand findings have also contributed to the Ministry's understanding of what's working and what's not. And this will also, I think its greatest impact will be that it will help to evolve and nuance and strengthen aspects of evidence for decision making.
Kia ora, Adam. Thank you for that. And if I sort of reflect back a little, and for our audience here today on the webinar, I think what you've just shared is, it's not just about the sort of value and potential of growing up in New Zealand, but I hope everyone uses Adam's reflections to start thinking about other questions that could be brought to the Growing Up in New Zealand data set. And I'll share a little bit later on in the webinar about how people can access the data set. But that was what I was really hearing from Adam, is the reflection from agencies such as the Ministry of Education, that there is a depth and richness in the data set. And we really encourage our colleagues out there, researchers, policymakers, to come ready with their best questions to be able to be answered through this longitudinal data set. So I might, we've been having lots of really great questions come through the Q&A, thank you. I'm going to take one of those questions, and I'm actually going to ask our colleague Denise to field this next one, please, because it relates to the work you presented in relation to cultural connectedness. So I'll read out the question, Denise. So it goes, I understand cultural connectedness can be a challenging measure in terms of reliability and validity when applied to the sole European grouping that we use in our analysis. The question is, have we found this to be a reliable measure amongst that sole European group?
Hilda, thank you, Sarah-Jane, and thank you for the participant asking this question. Yes, this is a really important question that we also had considered because we really see this cultural connectedness measure as quite an important measure, not just for this education snapshot, for many other things that we were looking at growing up in New Zealand. And so we did an extensive testing, psychometric evaluation of the NEIM, the cultural connectedness measure, at 12 years with the young people. And we found across the board, across all ethnic groups, that it had very strong, validity and good psychometric properties, including the European group. And that was the case also for the structure of this construct. So the cultural connectedness measure splits into two aspects. One is exploring about your ethnic identity, and the other aspect is affirmation. And so both of these were very similar across all of our ethnic groups, including European. So we could confirm that at 12 in detail. We have a publication of that available as well, which we can share. And we also did a psychometric screening at 15 years, where we also saw a similar pattern. So we're very confident that this works across groups. But we do acknowledge that there are some differences in terms of the strengths of the cultural connectedness. So compared to all other ethnic groups, so European young people tend to have lower cultural connectedness scores, so being less connected, and that's due to a variety of factors, including that obviously a lot of the things related to social norms and what is kind of considered normal or what is considered cultural. But yeah, overall, we're really confident about this measure.
Yeah, got it, Denise. I might put the next question to Jess. I really enjoyed the insights that you've provided today that came from the free text comments. So I think a lot of people know Growing Up in New Zealand to be this data-rich resource, and we really celebrate our role that we play within the sort of broader data ecosystem, sort of quantitative data. I wondered if you might share a little bit more about your experience working with the free text comments and sort of how you see the sort of quantitative and what we'll call qualitative data coming together to really deepen our understanding of the lives of currently 15-year-olds here in Aotearoa?
Thank you. Yeah, sure, Sarah Jane. Great question. Yes, so it's no secret that growing up in New Zealand holds a rich data set of, the quantitative information. But potentially what's less known, and this quantitative information is interpreted, and I'll circle back to that. But maybe what's less known is we have the privilege of collecting viewpoints of our young people directly from, I guess, them, from the horse's mouth. It's their voice. It's how they want to express themselves in our open text responses. And the really cool thing, I think, and I'm geeking out a bit because I've spent some time in these open text responses, and they're brilliant, heartbreaking and brilliant at the same time. But these open text responses also have longitudinal value because we've collected them across time points. So that's really exciting. But circling back to this intersection between the quantitative and the qualitative. I think we always need to remember with our quantitative analyses that we are interpreting. There is a number of rubrics or sort of interpretation lens going on when we look at this information, and that's still valuable, obviously, and I think it can be beautifully complemented by having the voices of young people and doing your qualitative analyses that look at potentially bringing to light the more intrinsic motivation. So if we're talking in an educational context, I think it's great to get a feeling for the intrinsic motivations for young people being at school. I think at 17 year, for example, this will be really valuable when our young people aren't legally having to be at school. So why are they still at school? And I think something like the open text responses will enrich that debate. I think it also, as I alluded to with when we discussed that deep dive into young people who we've identified as having a disability, I found it really interesting when they spoke, and I feel like their voices are probably some more of the marginalized voices in the young people's, in the young cohort. There were differences, and they came through quite clearly when the young people spoke for themselves about what they valued, what they were concerned about for the future, what they were looking forward to in the future.
Kia ora, Jess. Lots of really great points there around, sort of how data, qualitative or quantitative, are really a reflection or a representation of lived experience. And I do think that the work you've showed today sort of demonstrates our attempts to really capture that from a broader view. I wondered, the next question, Adam, I might bring this one to you, please. It's come from the audience today, and the question goes, what might be the implication of these findings? I suppose a snapshot. What might be the implication of these findings for the current reform of the New Zealand curriculum? Any thoughts there, please?
It's a great question. It's actually one I reflected on before coming, and I honestly don't have enough understanding of what's happening in the curriculum space. There's a lot of moving parts, and there's a lot coming through. A lot of smart people working very quickly. In terms of the ministry's supports, the curriculum is part of the piece of what the ministry is putting to schools in terms of making evidence-based changes, and I think it's also worth pointing out that at the moment, my perception is that the education minister, she has a very sharp focus on using evidence to inform decisions and doing her best to push the ministry to also follow that route. In terms of the curriculum per se, I honestly couldn't speak to that, although this will be filtering through to our curriculum colleagues. In terms of how it supports the ministry to make sure that the right supports get to the right students, this is very useful to inform that, also to inform the fledgling work of trying to work out, so the ministry doesn't collect data systematically on disabled students apart from all students. So this can also feed into that conversation of how do we go about that in a way that captures data that can inform our decisions and the school's decisions.
Kia ora, Adam. Next question, probably for for Jess, but also anyone else who might like to share on this. It's really a couple of questions coming through, inquiring about those sort of future aspirations and pathways. Jess, I think the questions are sort of really wanting to understand whether or not there were any differences we could see in terms of those post-school aspirations. You talked about a lot of young people thinking about university, but could we see any other potential pathways beyond school in the data, and also any further differences by sort of different demographic groups that you might like to dig into?
Yes, I mean university was about 30% of the cohort indicated that university was in their future trajectory, but a number, I don't have, the figure to hand, but I know that it was the next choice down was to go on with other forms of education, and that included things like trade training or tertiary education that wasn't in a university setting. So that also featured in the aspirations of young people, and I think that's probably another important conversation and another area that we could tease out further if we had the sort of time and the pages to be working with the data set. So anyone out there who wants to, as you say, use the data sets, there is that element of what does tertiary education look like for our young people. And in terms of, I mentioned a few differences because we have sort of pushed this idea that, and it's in the data, that tertiary education is at the forefront of young people, or the majority of young people in the GWINS in the growing up cohort. But there were differences, and I think that we should focus and analyze further those young people who don't see any further employment training, particularly, or education in their futures, and particularly those that don't see themselves finishing school. And while at 15 years, this is a relatively small percentage of the cohort, it's an incredibly important percentage of the cohort.
Kia ora, Jess, and I'll use that final comment to share with our audience today that the Growing Up in New Zealand team will be back in the field with our participants in the next few months doing the 17-year data collection wave. And so a real opportunity for us to be able to track these aspirations. But I think what you're saying is really think about what we can do to support young people to see opportunities and pathways beyond their sort of current health, high school or college environment. So we look forward to doing that work in the next few months. I think I've got time for one last question. I'm going to send it to you, Denise, because it picks up on the data that you presented earlier around discrimination. So the question was, or the person was asking whether or not we could discuss a little bit more the relationship between disability status, discrimination, and school satisfaction, recognizing that's a complicated but very important set of experiences and factors that are coming together and impacting on, a significant group of young people in the cohort. Any thoughts or reflections on that? And then if we've got time, Adam, you might have a reflection on the importance of understanding intersections for the work of the ministry.
Yeah, that's Sarah Jane, and thank you to the participant raising this question. Yeah, this is definitely an important aspect, and I think probably to add to what has been presented is that this was really just an initial opportunity to identify some of these associations. But we acknowledge that all of these relationships that we presented are very likely bidirectional in nature. So we didn't necessarily look into cause and causation, but mainly into these associations. And then obviously there's a whole intersection about across these experiences. And we saw as well that, for example, young people with disability experience also more discrimination generally as compared to people without disability. So already we see some compounded challenges that young people might be facing. And so it's definitely, I think, a lot of opportunity to explore this in much more detail and acknowledging all of these intersections. So a lot of potential for us to, and other researchers to look further into this, as well as into these developments across time. as mentioned, there's all this value in this longitudinal data, especially now heading into 17, where we also repeat a lot of these measures that we had at 15. So it will be really interesting to see how all of these things develop across time and how these impacts as well might contribute to that. So yeah, a lot of potential.
Kia ora, Denise. And just as I'm manuhere today, Adam, did you want to share any last reflections?
You mentioned intersections. Yes, so I mean, yes, it's very easy to look at a bidirectional relationship and say, how do these two factors work together? What's causing what, or the other factors that influence? And that's part of being a researcher, is having that Sherlock Holmes hat on and trying to work out, piece the puzzle together and work out what's happening here. I feel like there's a lot of value in talking about the cumulative, the kind of life course view of things here. There's a saying that very much comes to mind: small strokes fell great oaks, which tends to be used to mean that consistent minor efforts can overcome these big massive obstacles. If you keep on trying, you can get there. Success comes as a result of cumulative efforts, and we do see that for some students. The cumulative life course that ends, or that reaches the kind of desirable outcomes. If you take that's kind of the point of view of the woodcutter in that saying, the small strokes fell great oaks. If you take the point of view of the oak, the meaning's kind of reversed, but poignantly similar and akin to that kind of narrative of sustained hardship, the stresses that those students with disabilities, those experiencing discrimination, are going through. So I feel like there's a lot of value in thinking about life course outcomes, and the intersectionality of different variables, even though there's also richness in looking at those one-to-one relationships.
Kia ora, Adam.
Kia ora.
Okay. And thanks to our panel for a great discussion, and thank you to our audience for great questions. So just a few final messages from me, because I know we're almost at 1 p.m. So first off, if you're interested in hearing more from the Now We Are 15 series, please register and join us for our next webinar, which will be on Wednesday, March the 25th, where members of our team will share their findings from their mental health and wellbeing snapshot. So we look forward to seeing you then. Second message, for those of you who are interested in accessing the 15-year data, and please do, we need great questions coming through so that we can activate change. We'd love to see you at our data access workshop. The date and time is here on the screen. If you'd like to register for that workshop, please visit our website, where there are links to register for the data access workshop available. And really the final message from me is to express our deepest gratitude to the most important people, which are the participants of Growing Up in New Zealand, the young people and their caregivers who've given so much to the study, but actually for very little direct benefit to themselves. As you can see in this quote, we know that the participants in Growing Up in New Zealand do so because they believe in a future Aotearoa where every child and young person is supported to flourish. So our deepest gratitude to our participants. My thanks to Denise, Jess, and particularly Adam for joining us here on the webinar. And to all of you who've made time to join us today, thank you for the work that you do, particularly the work that you're all doing to support tamariki rangatahi, children and young people here in Aotearoa. Mauri ora, kia koutou katoa.